Hey everybody, welcome back to our leadership development webinar series about imposter syndrome. Today is our last webinar, and today we're talking about the fear of failure. As usual, these are not exhaustive conversations. These are going to be conversations that are going to barely scratch the surface of the topic we're talking about, in this case, imposter syndrome and the fear of failure. If you guys do have specific conversations or situations or scenarios to discuss, happy to do those in a one-to-one conversation. Please feel free to reach out to me and schedule some time for us to sit down and chat. Initial conversations are always free. But thank you guys so much for joining us. I hope you guys have been able to watch our series as we went through the whole process, all four of them, today being the fourth. If you haven't, I would encourage you guys to go back and watch those, at least the first one, because these all kind of build on each other a little bit. At least building on the first one. So that being said, thank you guys all again, and I will do some repetition in case you haven't watched those. In terms of who I am, so my name is Drew B. Harrell. Obviously, I am a business and executive coach, also the founder and CEO of Nyan Leadership. Nyan means eyes. The whole idea is you can't change or improve something until you're aware of it. And the more you see, the more you can do. And that's where the eyes piece of it comes from. I'm also an artist, writer, photographer, serial entrepreneur, and creator. For me, coaching is a creative art. I get to create my clients' futures with them, whether they are a business owner, whether they're an individual or a leader in organizations. It's co-creating their future and co-creating their leadership and who they want to be. So I co-create that with the clients and for them. I'm also a recovering attorney and former IT consultant, so my background's pretty varied. I do a lot of different things, and so that allows me to switch perspectives pretty easily. Also a huge nerd and a dog rescue enthusiast. That's my dog Hachi, and I love to explore with him. That's us out in Utah exploring the Grand Staircase Escalante. That was a really fun hike. Anyone who hasn't been out there and loves hiking or enjoys seeing amazing views, definitely make it out there if you can. So today, what are we talking about? We are talking about imposter syndrome, obviously. We're going to review the genesis of imposter syndrome, which we've done on every single one of these webinars, just because it's worth repeating, worth understanding fully what's going on here. We're going to understand that there is a rule, an unwritten underlying rule that's the root of your fear of failure, or anyone's fear of failure, frankly. We're also going to learn how that empowers your imposter, because your imposter does take power from that fear, because the imposter is made of fear, frankly. And then lastly, we're going to learn how to create some new rules for yourself to operate under so that you can overcome the imposter syndrome and allow yourself to deal with it better. Now, like I said previously in other conversations, other webinars, you're never really going to get rid of the imposter syndrome, right? It's impossible to get rid of it completely. It's going to be there even just a little bit, but you get much better at um, managing it to the point where it feels like it's not there anymore. It still comes up, but then you immediately deal with it and you keep moving forward. It doesn't hold you back anymore. And that's where we want to get you guys. Okay. So let's jump right in. The exaggerated esteem in which my life work is held makes me very ill at ease. I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler. So, once again, a quote from a very famous person. This time it is the late, great Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein had imposter syndrome. That is correct, ladies and gentlemen. You heard it here first. Maybe not first, but you've heard it. You're hearing it now. But Albert Einstein actually felt this way. So you're not alone. Okay. We've gone through some amazing folks in the last couple sessions. Michelle Obama, Maya Angelou. Albert Einstein had imposter syndrome, at least at this point in his career, in his life. And that's really telling in terms of the breadth and the width of how much this affects people, because at its core, it is based in fear. And every single human being has some level of fear in them. So quickly, we'll do a review of imposter syndrome again. What is imposter syndrome? It's the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of their own efforts, right? And this comes across because of lack of confidence, not because of, but comes across as a lack of confidence, feeling like a fraud or being afraid of discovered or exposed, constantly on edge, feeling like you're afraid of people are going to be discovered. Like, what if people don't find out that I don't know what I'm doing? What if I'm not as good as this as people think I am? What if? You're always waiting for the axe to drop, right? In companies, you're waiting to be fired. You're worried about it all the time. As a result, you become very risk averse. You don't want to take any kinds of risks, calculated or otherwise. Even if you know that that's the right course of action, you're not going to speak up, because what if things go wrong? What if it doesn't go the way it's supposed to go, the way you think it's going to go? And what if your theory is incorrect for some reason? That's the kind of fear we're talking about here. And it cripples people, right? It can be very crippling eventually, right? Where does that come from? Well, the imposter syndrome comes from the situation where you have the world on one side and you have your view of the world on the other, right? This is where we get into identity coaching. So you have different parts of your identity. The first part is your contextual identity. Now, your contextual identity is the piece of you that changes from situation to situation, from role to role. It depends on external validation and it depends on what you're doing in the moment. So, for example, you'll be with your family and you'll have one way of behaving, one way of thinking, one way of acting. On the other side of things, you'll leave your family, drive to work. Suddenly, work is going to be a different context in which you act differently. You're going to say different things. You're going to speak maybe a little bit differently. You're going to act differently. You're going to refer to yourself or others a little bit differently. Right. Then you go to hang out with your friends. And then that also is a third way of operating. You can have multiple different ways of acting in terms of different contextual identities. But at the core of yourself, in terms of your core values, your core beliefs, that doesn't change. And that part of you is your absolute identity, right? That's the part where who you are when you're alone, right? When it can never be taken away. Your context can always change, right? If you have a job, even if you've been in that job for 40 years, that can be taken away, right? If you retire, if you get fired, if you get laid off, if you just decide to change careers. I had a client like that. He was an attorney for 40 something years. And then the firm decided to do layoffs and suddenly he wasn't an attorney anymore, right? At least that was the mentality he had. And he was felt completely lost because his entire identity was wrapped up in his contextual identity. He had mistaken his contextual identity for his absolute identity. And that's a danger that can happen for people a lot of times. So understanding that there's a difference between your absolute identity and your contextual identity is extremely essential. The other way to look at your absolute identity is it's who you are when you're alone with your pet. If you have a pet, if you have a dog or cat, who are you when you're acting with them when no one else is around? That's who you are. That's your absolute identity, right? Now, both of these identities act as a filter. You have information that comes in from the world. It gets filtered through your contextual identity, and it becomes a story, right? It becomes something else. Then the information is not objective anymore. It becomes colored by your identity, and then it becomes colored again by your other identity. Now, these are the way that these things function. They filter information out. Now, again, these filters may seem like they're bad or that they're not really giving you the full picture. And in reality, they're really not. But they're there to be filters for a reason, right? They're there to be giving you information that's relevant to you in terms of what you're looking out for. And this is something we'll talk about shortly, but it's a survival mechanism, right? It's evolution based. So no one's really aware of this until you really think about what's going on for yourself and think about who you are and what your different identities are. Only then do you become aware of these different filters that you have going through with the information coming in from the world. All right. Now, the other piece to be aware of is the absolute identity can only be changed intentionally, right? You can only change that if you are actually sitting there working on yourself and saying, I want to really change this part of me or change my beliefs around this, or really examine my values and make sure these are the right values for me to be successful, however you define success. That's something that can only be done intentionally. Now, we're talking about imposter syndrome. It's a misalignment of these identities, right? Your absolute identity is not caught up to your contextual identity. And that's where you need to do the actual work on your absolute identity to say, I'm capable of doing what I need to do, right? This context that may feel uncomfortable or may feel too much for me is not too much for me. Actually, I can actually do this. So where does the fear of failure come from? Right. Well, first of all, we have to understand what fear of failure actually is. Fear of failure is not just fear of failure. Okay. It's a fear of what happens after you fail, or what you think will happen at least. Right. Now, like the imposter, it's meant to keep you safe, right? And it's not doing a great job of that, right? Because it holds you back. Now, this may sound very similar to imposter syndrome because it is very similar. And because, again, remember, they're both based in fear. But fear of failure really is fear of being wrong. It's a fear of judgment, a fear of not being good enough, fear of not being lovable, fear of not being accepted, right? It's egocentric. It's not thinking about your higher self. It's thinking about the lower self version of yourself, right? And the reason those fears matter is because of, again, evolution, right? You think back to evolutionary man, to tens of thousands of years ago, maybe a million years ago, right? When humans were first created on the earth, right? Whether you believe in whatever whatever theories you believe in, when humans existed in the old school caveman era, right? It's a fear of being cast out that's been driven into your genetics. Now, that fear of being cast out may not seem like a big deal right now, if you think about it in today's world, because look at the pandemic. We're all in our own kind of things, but we still have some kind of connection through Zoom or whatever, or otherwise. If you're talking about casting out, we're talking about being completely cast out and shunned. Now, that fear of being cast out, it was a death sentence, because back then, being cast out of a tribe, being cast out of a community meant you were on your own in the wilderness. You had to be accepted to survive, because you had to be accepted to be part of this community, to be part of the tribe. If you left the tribe, if you're on your own, you were probably going to die, because everyone in the tribe had a role. Everyone in the tribe had work to do. Everyone in the tribe supported each other, and it depended on the community. The whole idea of it takes a village to raise a child, because back then it did, right? But evolution happened, and over time, human beings have become more and more independent. That doesn't mean that you can be off on your own for 100%, and it doesn't really matter if you're by yourself or not. It still matters to some extent, but we're able to be a little more independent in some ways than we used to be, right? Partially because there's not just that one tribe anymore. Remember, back then it was very nomadic, right? Tribes were so spread apart, so far apart from each other, that it wasn't, the chance of you finding another tribe that accepted you was probably pretty unlikely. If another tribe found you back then and that you weren't part of their tribe, they'd probably kill you because you were a threat, right? Again, living out of fear. So what happens here is that you're giving yourself more, you're giving that situation more meaning than it's actually worth, right? You're giving that failure more, you're blowing it up automatically. It's like, oh, if I do this, then this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen. You start going on the snowball effect. That snowball effect is not real, right? The many potential causes of this, again, are all come down to the idea of fear of being cast out. And that's not going to really happen. So this actually empowers your imposter, because it's based in fear. Okay. And that fear is that rule you've created about how the world works. It's a longer rule, right? Because now you're saying, if I fail, then that means I'll be judged, or I'll be wrong, or whatever. But then fast forward a couple little jumps there, logical jumps, and it becomes, if I fail, jump, 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 I'll be cast out. And if I'm cast out, I'm going to die. So that's what the fear of failure comes from, right? Somewhere or another, when you track that down, it becomes, if I'm cast out, I'm not good enough. If I'm cast out, I'm not lovable. If I'm cast out, I'm not worth anything. And you attach it to your worth, and that becomes a much bigger meaning than it actually has. The fact of the matter is, you don't actually really know what's going to happen if you fail, right? There's exactly as much likelihood that nothing happens, or that something good happens if you fail, as if something bad happens, right? You don't necessarily acknowledge that, though. We think about the what ifs and the worst case scenario, but it's very similar to Schrodinger's cat. For those of you who are not familiar with Schrodinger's cat, Schrodinger was a psychiatrist or psychologist back in the day. And his theory was about a cat. There's a cat in a box that's covered. You can't see inside the box. There's no light getting into the box, but there's a little poison pellet in the box. And if the cat eats the poison, it will die. The cat doesn't eat the poison, it'll be fine. But until you open that box, you don't know if the cat's alive or dead. And so, as morbid as that sounds, given that not everyone, but many people like pets nowadays, I love pets personally. As morbid as that is, the concept is, until you confirm what the actual situation is inside that box, the cat is both alive and dead. So the same is true with fear of failure. Until you confirm exactly what happens if you fail, then you have just as much likelihood as succeeding, or as something good happening out of that failure, as something bad happening from that failure. So you being afraid of the failure doesn't really make any sense. But that, understanding that now is the beginning of that conversation. But now you think about what happens with the imposter. The imposter is going to be empowered by that idea, the idea that fear is driving this conversation, right? And because of that, that's what empowers it, what makes it stronger, and what really puts it into overdrive. If you have a fear of failure on top of imposter syndrome, it's like exponentially more powerful. So remember, the genesis of imposter is born of fear, right? It's the lizard brain. It's our lizard brain part of ourselves. It doesn't really rationalize as much, except that the difference is there's no fight. It's all fight. it's all flight or freeze. There's no fight involved. So you're not going to fight for anything. You're not going to go after what you want. You're going to run away from something, or you're going to freeze and let it take over and hope that it goes away. So how do we deal with this? Well, that takes us to an activity. All right. And those of you who have been in the last couple of sessions are aware of how we do these activities here. So again, if you're driving a vehicle or if you're operating any heavy machinery or anything like that right now, please stop or please wait till later to do this. Pause, pick this back up another time. Don't do this while you're doing anything that requires your attention. That's dangerous. This is where the fear part actually matters and really comes in to take care of you. So be mindful of this when you're talking about this. So I invite you all to close your eyes. Take a deep breath with me for kind of 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold it for 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And out through your mouth for 4, 3, 2, 1. In for 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold it for 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And out for 4, 3, 2, 1. Continue breathing as we continue to talk here. And I want you to dig deep and think about the core of your fear of failure. Really think about it. What is it really a fear of? Remember, I said it's not really a fear of failure, but it's a fear of what happens as a result of the failure. What's the perceived result of your failure? And it's perceived because it's not actually true. It's just a story you have in your head. Remember, your identities are filtering the information from the world and telling you the story that you allow them to craft. So what happens if you fail? You don't have to answer out loud, just answer to yourself. Feel free to write down whatever you think about. But what's the result? Ask the question, what now? What happens now? And take that question to its logical end. That logical end, that's what you're afraid of. That's what you're actually afraid of. Now let's play it out. What does it actually say about you? You personally, if you fail. If you fail, what are your options? What are your paths that you can choose from? How do you move forward? Have you succeeded at everything you've tried ever in your life the first time you tried it? If the answer is no, and chances are the answer is no, then you've failed once before. Now, what happened when you failed? Did the world end? Were you cast out and shunned? Again, chances are no, because you're still here. Now, I want you to take some time and think about a family member or a friend, someone you're really close to. And I want you to imagine in your head that they came up to you and they told you that they were afraid. They were afraid of whatever it is that you're actually afraid of from the earlier conversation. That thing that you said that the logical end of what your fear of failure takes you. That's what they told you they're afraid of. What would you tell them? What would be your advice to them? Now, what's a more productive rule to create for yourself? What actually makes sense? Now, that's what you want to tell your imposter right now. Remember in session 1, we named our imposters. So I want you to call your imposter. Tell your imposter, this is a rule you've created about how the world works. And that rule is faulty. The fact of the matter is you don't really know what would happen if you, quote unquote, fail. There's exactly as much likelihood that if you fail, nothing happens. There's also exactly as much likelihood that if you fail, something good happens. Remember, it's Schrodinger's cat. And like before, it's a measured response. It's a measured, calculated risk. Is it worth the failure? And this again, it's not always going to be worth the risk of failure. But is it worth the risk of failure for you right now? If it is, then you own it. Repeat it to yourself. Create that new rule for yourself and reinforce it to yourself. Continue breathing while we talk about this. And then whenever you feel your fear of failure coming back and your imposter starts getting louder and louder, go through this exercise one more time. Feel free to play this as many times as you need to, but remind yourself of your new rule. And that rule is that if it's worth it, if this risk of failure is worth it, there's nothing to be afraid of. Because even in failure, there's still an opportunity to learn. There's an opportunity to get closer to your goal because you're in pursuit of your goal. Remember, again, a couple sessions ago, when you're running from something, when you're operating out of fear, you don't know where you're going. You can run into something worse. So it's not worth that kind of fear or operating out of fear. On the other hand, when you're operating out of desire, out of a goal that you want to go after, and you know that's the thing you want to do, then that risk is worth it most of the time. And you know where you're going. You know what your end result is going to be. Your path may not be direct, but you know where to get there. So how do we deal with the imposter in this situation? Well, first you got to remember who the imposter is. And it's going to be very familiar to some of you who've seen the other sessions we talked about, because it's going to be the same exact strategy for dealing with the imposter. Remember why the imposter is. The imposter is there to protect you, but is operating out of fear, not goals or desire. So you have to shift that and operate yourself out of fear, out of goals and desire instead of out of fear. Separate you from the imposter. And that's what you do when you name it, when you give it someone else's name that's someone who cares about you, but they're annoying as all hell. They mean really well, but they're really, really annoying. And they don't know when to shut up. So you have to tell them when to shut up. Address the imposter's concerns. The imposter's concerns are, if you fail, you're going to get cast out of society, right? If you fail, then that rule we talked about just now, what are you actually afraid of? That's what the imposter's afraid of. That's not just your fear. That's your imposter's fear embodied in whatever's happening right now. So it's really about addressing that particular core fear. And then you keep moving forward. Keep pushing yourself forward. And understand that you can prove yourself right. Because either it's worth it, it's either worth the risk or it's not. Decide that. If it's worth the risk, then you address your imposter and say, listen, it's worth the risk. I got this. I don't need you to protect me. I don't need you to hold me back from this. And that fear of failure, that fear of whatever it is that's happening at the end of the tunnel, whatever that failure, you think that failure means, it doesn't mean that. So what now? Understand the goal of your imposter and where it's coming from. That's another common one we talked about before. But spend time on a regular basis, whether daily, weekly at least, to reinforce your new rule. Whatever that new rule is you created for yourself, reinforce it. Take time to make that into one of your affirmations. If you're not familiar with affirmations, we can talk about that in another video. But essentially what you're doing is you're using your own voice to reinforce your beliefs. And do this on a regular basis, whether, again, daily, ideally, but at the very least weekly, or maybe a couple times a week, as often as you can. And again, remind yourself on the same regular basis that the old rule is not proven. The old rule is Schrodinger's cat. The outcomes are not set in stone. You don't know what the outcomes are going to be. So they could be good, they could be bad, they could be indifferent. Any one of them, there's just as much likelihood that any of those happen. Lastly, address your imposter directly. Don't be afraid. When you shift from fear-based thinking to goal-based thinking, the fear melts away over time. But you have to practice it, you have to reinforce it. So, that all being said, thank you all so much. I appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed this series. Again, like I said, please feel free to reach out to me if you want to connect and chat more about your specific situation. how to deal with this on your side of things. The help I've shared here is relatively generic. It's more general, obviously generalized for the audience as a whole. But what you're talking about, whatever your fears might be more complicated, might be more in depth than needed here. And we're happy to talk with you about that and see how we can tackle it directly. Thank you again so much. I appreciate it, all of you. Thank you for staying with us for the entire series. Those of you who have, even if you tune in just for one series, one session, still thank you so much again for that. Take care, stay safe. Feel free to check out my YouTube, reach out to me by email, and that QR code will take you to my calendar if you want to schedule some time with me. Thank you all. Take care. Have a great week. Have a great day and stay safe. Bye-bye.